Hey guys, so this is AP World History, Chapter 21, Reaching Out, Expanding Horizons of Cross-Cultural Interaction. All right, so today is a pretty important chapter. It's going to cover a lot of different things, a lot of different topics. So it's really, really important that you pay attention because this chapter and the next couple of chapters are pretty big in setting the stage for kind of bringing the whole world together, kind of bringing the Americas together with everything we already know about Europe and Asia and all that. So pay attention. Don't just listen to the screencast, but also read the slides too. That will help you out a lot, especially when you take your quizzes, especially these next couple of quizzes. So it's important that you read and you pay attention to what I'm saying. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start first with long distance trade and travel. Trading cities in particular. So trade went two ways, and you should already know this by now. If it's not going to go by land, the trade is going to go by maritime trade, by the ocean, through the ocean, whatever, however you want to see it. So luxury goods of high value relative to weight, like stones and silk, they went through the Silk Road. So you got to kind of think like the smaller things, the things that I can usually carry in not such large quantities, like diamonds, gold, that kind of thing. I'm probably going to take that through the Silk Roads. However, if it's bulkier commodities like steel or stone, anything in massively large quantities that is much heavier, that's going to go through the sea lanes. All right, so just keep that in mind. So now we're in these two ways to have long distance trade, depending on what kind of goods I'm bringing back. Also, trading ports and cities are growing at a much rapid pace because of long distance trade, because everybody knows where certain goods are and where they have to go to get them. So people are going to take advantage of that, especially people who are living along the ports, who have that close access to the sea. They're going to start developing more. One of the well-known trading or principal trading routes was Malacca. This was probably the most well-known one in Eastern Indian Ocean. As we see long distance travel occur, Marco Polo, he will come into play as well. He is a Venetian and he traveled for the Mongols very well. So he comes into the Mongol land, and especially with Kublai Khan, that's who he traveled for. Very well liked. He did a lot of diplomatic missions for the Mongols actually, and he wrote a book, about his travels because he came back to Italy. He actually got imprisoned. The person who was with him was a writer. So he was telling this writer the stories about what he experienced, things he saw in his travels, and that writer published the book. And the book people started to read all over in Europe, and it made these merchants want to go out and discover the world and see the world that Marco Polo had seen. So it influenced, like I said, the readers because it mentioned the goods in his travels, and European merchants wanted to take part in that. They wanted to get access to the goods he saw. They wanted to get access to the jewels that he saw as well. So then they could also make money as well. So you can see how, a writer or how Marco Polo, how one person's experiences and how you have these trading cities that are coming about as well, how these are influencing long distance trade. In terms of political and diplomatic travel, we see again the blending of two different societies together, especially with Mongol Christian diplomacy. Both Mongols and Christians were attacking the Muslims pretty much at the same point at one time. And what ends up happening is Pope Innocent IV, he invites the Mongols to convert and join. He says, you know what? Come and join us. We're trying to we're trying to attack the Mongols so we can recapture Jerusalem. We could kind of really use your help. The Mongols decline and say, well, you know what? Maybe you should join us, or if not, we'll probably just destroy you. And of course, they declined as well. So they decline and they invite Christians to do the same. Mongols also, they will use Robin Sama. He is a Nestorian Christian who was, living in the Mongol land to kind of help the Mongols convince the Christians to ally with them. So Robin Sama will go to Europe and he'll, experience kind of like the royal treatment when he's there. But the Christians will still not side with the Mongols. But the important thing here is that we see diplomatic affairs are happening and that they're complex, especially in the East, because you're working with two different sides. Yes, you have the main goal, but the reasons to get to that main goal are totally different. And you're not willing to compromise, your beliefs, and you're not willing to compromise I guess, your kind of government policies in order to reach that main goal. So, but the point is that you are seeing this diplomacy exist. Another way that we see political and diplomatic travel is through Ibn Battuta. So Ibn Battuta is almost like the Muslim version of Marco Polo. He's a Muslim traveler, very well liked where he went, and obviously a lot of the times, most of the time, he went to Muslim lands. Okay, so all through the Middle East, even into Africa as well. He was very educated in legal matters. He was a lawyer, so he knew a lot about Sharia, about Islamic law. And so it was very easy for him to blend into these different lands that he went to because of the experience that he held. And it, like I said, made it easy for him to find government positions where he went. And he also found that he was most helpful to those areas that had, just recently become Muslim, because he was able to explain to them how the law worked, how the culture was practiced. But again, he was also a political and diplomatic traveler, and very similar to Marco Polo in that way. The next thing we see is missionary campaigns. So the Sufis, we've already seen them before. They're kind of like the hippies of the Muslims, and they will help during this time to spread Islam. And again, they're not big on like, hey, you have to practice this way, you have to do this ritual. No, they're more like, hey, as long as you believe in Allah, it's all good. All right? We just want you to convert. So they're being flexible and led to less resistance. In addition to seeing these Muslim kind of hippie Sufi missionaries, we also see Christian missionaries as well during this time. And a lot of them begin to go east. Many Christians are going to attempt to convert people in the east to Christianity, and they sought to convert a lot of times, obviously, the Mongols and the Chinese. But for the most part, it really didn't work. And it didn't work because the places they were going, they had already had long established either religions or philosophies that they already believed in. They were either already practicing Confucianism, or they were practicing Buddhism or Hinduism. So you're not going to find a lot of converts there. And really, what these Christian missionaries did appeal to were the expatriate communities from Europe. Meaning, an expatriate means like you're coming from another place. So it's like if you were a US citizen and now you live in France, you're considered an expatriate. And that's kind of what these communities were. These were these people that lived in Europe. Now, for whatever reason, probably just because they're merchants, now they live in China, and these missionaries are now appealing to them more than trying to convert people. So expatriate communities from Europe created a demand for the Roman Catholic services, and they're really the only ones that it appealed to. However, we do see John Montecorvino. He was an Italian Franciscan missionary. He was probably the most well-known, the most active in China in terms of converting. He tried to establish Christianity in China, but again, very few followers are attracted because we already had these long-established religions and philosophies there. Um, in addition, another reason why it became difficult to attract people was because of the geography. Geography hurt Roman Catholic conversion, and so did other already established religions. Like I mentioned, you're so far away from like kind of the capital, the main head of the church, that it becomes difficult to, promote and push Christian missionary on people or Christian conversion, because there's only so few of you there, that it takes longer to get there. So geography did play another role. But the idea is that these missionary campaigns, they were in existence. Moving on still to long distance travel and cross cultural exchanges. Obviously, if we see that people are trading, that we have missionaries moving around, it's obvious that cultural exchanges existed. So, long distance travel of all kinds encourage exchanges of all societies. And these exchanges were, it wasn't just about, oh, we're exchanging goods, but again, we're exchanging science, we're exchanging technologies, agriculture, poetry, we're exchanging everything now in a larger amount, in fuller force as well. So all this was going to promote cultural diffusion. So it's not like we're kind of isolated anymore, or only a few merchants are going here and there. Now we're seeing a large movement. And again, this large movement is making things readily available to everybody. Muslims, in particular, they will introduce citrus fruits in the sub-Saharan Africa, cotton in West Africa. They'll diffuse sugarcane to Southwest Asia, North Africa, and Europe. And sugarcane is going to be a major player because it's going to help lead to the slave labor and plantations that you're going to read about later in different, labor systems. So that was important too. Another major diffusion was gunpowder technology. And it was really through the Mongols that we see the spread of gunpowder from east to west. Because remember, it starts in China, and at first they don't realize the power of it. But then as time progresses, people are able to harness it better. And it's really the Europeans who fine tune that use of gunpowder technology. So that's really what's going on in terms of long distance trade and travel. Everything is just kind of happening at a faster rate. We're seeing more diffusion happen. There's more political diplomacy occurring as well. So now we're going to look at crisis and recovery in these areas. First, it starts with the bubonic plague, especially with the Little Ice Age. So around 1300, there's this kind of like global climate change where the temperatures drop significantly, especially in the European areas. And this is going to obviously hurt agriculture for a while. All right. In addition to this, we also see the spread of the bubonic plague or the Black Death. And this started in China, all right, in Yunnan, China. And it wasn't until the Mongols came along in the 1300s and the merchants, as again, long distance travel is becoming much more popular and faster, that the bubonic plague spreads into Europe. So essentially, what it is fleas on rats are carrying this disease, and it begins to kill pretty much like more than a third of the population, especially in Europe. And there's not really a known cure for it, and people think that they're being punished. So it does have that kind of religious effect to it. Areas, though, there were some areas that did not see the plague, and those were the northernmost parts of Europe. It just didn't reach there. India, probably because of the geographic barrier of the Himalayas, and again, sub Saharan Africa, also probably because of geography, because it was a desert as well. And it's just that the trading that occurred there was more land based trade than maritime trade, than sea trade. So some of these social and economic effects of the bubonic plague is that it disrupted societies and economies in Europe and northern Africa. Um, People were dying at massive rates, and urban workers wanted higher wages. So you kind of got to think about this as an economist, okay? So people are dying, a lot of, just regular workers are dying. So that gives room for peasants or people who are not earning as much to kind of, hey, and ask, hey, you know what? We want higher wages because we're still alive. We can work for you. So it kind of errs on the side of the peasant or the low paid worker because they are alive. They can ask for more money. And it was difficult for people to say no to what they were asking for. And some governments, they tried to freeze the wages, but they just didn't have the power to do that. It was like the workers were outweighing what the government wanted. Lords even wanted to reinstate serfdom, where you're working off the land, and it just didn't happen. Workers were asking for more wages, and the demand for them was there. So, they had to meet that demand. But again, it very much changed how the, I guess, labor system was beginning to work at that time. So we're going to move on from Europe to China, especially with the development of the Ming Dynasty. And it starts with the Yuan Dynasty falling. Remember, the Yuan Dynasty was a part of the Mongols with Kublai Khan. So that dynasty will fall. The Mongols will leave. Hongwu will become the emperor of the Ming Dynasty. He was an orphan who lived with, who became, well, not became, but lived with the the monks in the monasteries. The military saw how strong he was, so he goes into the military, and pretty much he will conquer. He will be like the leader and the one to conquer the Yuan dynasty and establish the Ming dynasty. And he pretty much got rid of anything Mongol, any hint of Mongol land or Mongol culture he got rid of. He went back to the traditional Chinese models. He brought back the Confucian schools. He brought back the civil service exams. And he was really big on just reestablishing Chinese culture. And he used the eunuchs and mandarins to help him do this. The would help them enhance the government and central authority. Mandarins were usually the officials, and they acted as emissaries, and they were the ones that went to the different cities and kind of spoke on behalf of the emperor. And eunuchs, they were important because they could not build families or power bases. So eunuchs were men who were castrated, okay, who had their testicles removed essentially. And so obviously it makes sense that an emperor feels they can trust him because they know, well, they can never produce a family. They can never go against me. They're always going to be loyal to me. They're never going to want to try to go for my power. So this gave absolute obedience to policies and initiatives of the government, and that was important, especially for the Ming dynasty that barely come and recaptured this area. So we also see in China this economic recovery and cultural revival. They rebuilt irrigation systems that had gotten pretty much deteriorated because the Mongols never took care of them. They focused back on making lacquerware, silk, and cotton. And for a while, there was no trade with other lands, and they really didn't want to focus on, pretty much trading outside with other lands. They were pretty more focused on themselves and within themselves. They got rid of, like I said, any signs of Mongol rule. And that's really where the Ming dynasty will be. They're going to kind of stay focused on themselves. We'll look a little bit at Zheng He, but for the most part, they're coming inward, and that's really going to be a downfall for them. All right, so that's China right there. We're going to jump back to Europe and state building. So we see taxes, armies, and Italian states that begin to be established. Regional states held political authority, and Western Europe grew stronger societies and monarchies. So what's going to begin to happen is that kings and queens are going to have more power. The nobility is not going to be as strong as it used to be, but the kings and queens are still going to remain strong. And then in Italy, we're going to see these major cities of Milan, Florence, and Venice. They're going to be centers of wealth because of their trading ports. So France and England, they will have 100 Years' War. And essentially what this war was a war about some land in France that the English wanted. So it was a fought over land intermittently on and off for about 100 years. That's why it's called the 100 Years' War. And what this taught France and England was that they were going to have standing armies at some point. England didn't really have one, but France, they maintained a standing army. And the only way that they could keep these armies was by levying taxes. And that's how they were going to assemble these armies. And a central government was going to begin, like I said, to overpower nobility. So nobility, like the dukes and the duchess and all that kind of stuff, they're going to lose their power when, the government will kind of take over and say, you know what, we just need the king and the queen and whatever government is. We don't really need all these little dukes and duchesses and barons and baronesses. We just kind of need this government and our king and queen. Looking at Spain and Russia, in Spain, again, we see Ferdinand and Isabel. They will unite the wealthiest Iberian realms. So Ferdinand and Isabel kind of had Spain split. And what they decide to do is they decide, you know what, we're going to marry, we're going to unite our realms together, and we're going to be the strongest realm that we have as Catholics. And when they do this, they're able to do the Reconquista in Spain, meaning that they're able to drive out Jews, they're able to drive out Muslims. Anybody who wasn't Catholic, they pretty much drive them out, and they reconquer Spain in the name of Catholicism. All right, and that's what happens to them, and they become very strong and powerful in that way. Moving to Russia, with Russia, we see Ivan III, he will end the tribute to the Mongols. Because remember, the Mongols, they established themselves in 4 sections, in 4 areas of land in Asia. One of them was in Russia. And remember that they didn't really want to govern Russia, they just wanted tribute from them. So Ivan III, who's this leader in Russia, says, you know what, we're not going to give you tribute anymore. And by him ending the tribute is pretty much ending the Mongol, I guess, authority there, the Mongol power there. And so what will begin to happen is that he'll establish his own principality, and the origin will be in Muscovy, Russia. And it will establish a strong central government. And so now Russia will kind of be its own player and be its own state at this point. And it'll get rid, like I said, of the Mongols. The other recovery that we see happen in Europe is something called the Renaissance. And Renaissance means rebirth. So this will happen from the 13th to the 1500s in Europe, and they get their inspiration from classical Greece and Rome. So this is pretty much like, hey, we're kind of bringing back the old school stuff. We're bringing back those classical, Greece and Roman thoughts, the Greece and Roman architecture, the Greece and Roman art, and we're going to make it better. We're going to make it to suit us. So that's really what they did. It represented human form and emotion. Architecture, again, was going to be like the domed buildings and stuff like that. So it played an important role. Other things we see that come out of the Renaissance are this idea of humanism. So humanism is interested in what it sounds like, in humanities. And today, humanities, there's like humanities classes, and those are considered like history, literature, philosophy. That is what the humanities is. And again, they're inspired by the Greek and Roman works, philosophical works. And what they began to realize was that, you know, being Christian and being yourself on an everyday basis, you can merge these two lives together, that you can live morally virtuous life and you could still be an active member in your society. You didn't have to go off and be a monk, just pray and live a strict life. You could still be Christian in your everyday life, just as long as you were moral and virtuous and you thought about how you could act as a Christian in your everyday life. So that's what really humanism brought. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is exploration and colonization during this time. So I had mentioned Zhang He and his expeditions. So the Ming Dynasty, again, they didn't necessarily want to trade with anybody. They just wanted people to realize, hey, look, we're back and we're strong. So they sent Zhang He, who was a eunuch, an admiral, to lead many of these expeditions to kind of show people. So there were 7 expeditions, naval expeditions, to impose presence in the Indian Ocean. Just again, to kind of say, look at us, we're powerful, we're back, recognize us as a powerful figure in this area. Again, the 2 purposes: impose imperial control over foreign trade with China and impress people with the power and might of the Ming Dynasty. And when they went to these different lands, they dispensed gifts and received gifts, very exotic gifts, okay, very exotic animals, that kind of thing. So Zhang He tried diplomacy to reach his goals and make people realize, like, you should recognize us as strong and powerful. If he would impose Chinese might if he needed to. If people didn't, realize, yes, I do recognize you as strong and powerful and you're back, then he felt he would have to do this through military force. Like I said, 7 expeditions succeeded in establishing Chinese might in the Indian Ocean. People said, yes, we recognize you as strong, as powerful. We recognize you as potential trading partners as well. So his expeditions were successful to that extent. However, the voyages will end. In 1430, the Ming Emperor will end these expeditions. The Confucians that, come back, they see this, as kind of a waste of money. Why are we sending him on these expeditions that are proving to be what? Just to show off? Just to make sure people are going to trade with us? Like, what good is that doing for us? So Confucian ministers felt expense could be better used for agriculture. And they felt, you know what? We really need to focus on making ourselves strong internally. Kind of like, let's make China great again. That kind of idea. the way it's let's make America great again with Donald Trump. Yeah, this is kind of what China decides to do. And it's definitely going to backfire on them, as we see later on. So treasure ships began to be decommissioned, and Chinese would forget how to create these large vessels. So these large vessels, the ones that you see here that could carry like 500 people and so many tons of goods back, they will stop making them. They will get decommissioned. They'll stop making them, and China will never really trade on a large scale the way we're going to see the Europeans trade. And like I said, this is really going to hurt them very much so. So this is very important for you to understand, because China, that was this, beacon of technology and making all these different technologies like the compass, the astrolabe, these large ships and this and that, it's going to close itself up, and it's going to leave the door open for Europe to come in and kind of take over and be that strong force in the world. Which brings us to the European exploration. So, Portuguese exploration and colonization of Atlantic. So, the Portuguese, they are the first in Atlantic exploration. All right. A lot of people think maybe it was Spain or Britain or France. No, it was actually Portugal. And they first to try to find a new route to Asian markets through Indian Ocean. So to them, this was their thinking. They were like, you know what? We're like paying a middleman to get goods, spices, and all these goods. Meaning, like, here they are, Europe, they're traveling, trying to get to India, and they have to pay this middleman who's usually like a Muslim merchant to get the goods. And they're thinking, how can we get straight to the source? So they thought, you know what, there has to be a better way than traveling by land. And they thought, you know what, let's find a way to get there by sea, by the ocean. So they're the first to try it. Prince Henry the Navigator wanted to spread Christianity and increase Portuguese influence in the seas. And we're going to get more into that in the next chapter about the reasons for exploration. One of them definitely was the gold, the idea of, making more money. But another one was this idea of God, of spreading Christianity as well. Portuguese colonized in the Atlantic and along the West African coast. So this is kind of where they kind of settle in. Slave trade and the Indian Ocean. So Portuguese always had traded guns and manufactured items for slaves. It had always been that way. As colonization increased, so did the volume of trade in slaves. So as they're beginning to try to find ways to get to the Indian Ocean, they begin to colonize more and more, which means they need more slaves, which means that the slave trade is going to increase. So often these slave or these people that were buying the slaves, the Portuguese, they they often use the slaves as plantation labor. And again, we'll see that in these different labor systems that come up in the other chapters. Other explorers sought new routes to Asian silk and spices, and they didn't want to deal with the intermediaries. Like I told you, it's like, why are we going to travel through land and this Muslim merchant is going to hike up the price on something that we could go straight to the source and get it at a cheaper price? So they didn't want to deal with those intermediaries, that middleman. And explorers like Bartolomé Diaz and Vasco da Gama will also contribute to discovering other routes. Lastly, we're going to see Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus believed that you can sail west to reach Asian markets. Now, he was not Spanish, okay? Christopher Columbus was not Spanish, but he needed somebody to finance this mission. So he went to Ferdinand and Isabel to underwrite his campaign, meaning he went to them to ask them and say, hey, look, I have this idea that if we travel west, we can get to India faster. And that means we can get the goods at a cheaper price. Ferdinand and Isabel, again, they want to show their power as a realm. So they say, all right, go ahead. We'll give you the money. So in 1492, he sets sail, and him and his crew land in the Bahamas. And they thought he reached the land. He insisted he reached the land near Asia. He insisted he was in the Indies because he saw Indians. So he thought, this is it. We're here. We're in the Indies. And obviously, we know that's not true. He reached a part of the Americas, what is considered the Americas. And, through his discovery, others will discover there's a whole new world that's not just Europe and Asia and Africa. So it showed that there was a different world apart from, like I said, Europe, Asia, and Africa. All right. So that's pretty much it. I know it was a really long screencast. Sorry about that. Um, but there's a lot of important stuff in here. So I really, really suggest that you look it over, look the slides over again, read them over because a lot of stuff happened during between this time 13 to 1500s that it's super important for you to understand. All right, we'll see you later.